Hello everyone, welcome back for new historical mystery stories. Please make yourself comfortable, sit or lie down. You can close your eyes at any time and still be able to follow. Our first story will take us once again to the land of the pharaohs, and we will discuss a supposed curse of the pharaohs, affecting those who dared to break into their tombs. So, to begin with, let's talk about the tomb of Tutankhamun. This was one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries of all times. In 1922, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter discovered a rival tomb that had remained almost untouched for more than 3,000 years, almost by accident. You know that in the period of Egyptian history called the New Kingdom, that was between the 16th and the 11th centuries BC, the capital of Egypt had moved south to the city of Thebes. Thebes is a Greek name. The Egyptians called this city Waset or Weset. And the New Kingdom is considered a separate period in history because it began with the reconquest of all Egypt by kings of the south of Upper Egypt, who ruled from Thebes. Before they retook their country, Egypt had been for several generations under the rule of a foreign people that had come from the east, from the Middle East, called the Hyksos. These Hyksos had progressively invaded Egypt, starting with the delta of the Nile, at a time when the kingdom was weakened, and they had overthrown the Egyptian dynasty to replace it with a new one of foreigners. The power of the Hyksos pharaohs was strong in the north, but in the south, in Upper Egypt, they only controlled the country through the allegiance of Egyptian nobles, who paid tribute, taxes, but also sometimes revolted. In the 16th century BC, a rebellion led by the rulers of Waset arose in the south, and in a few years they expelled the Hyksos from Egypt and put back a new Egyptian-born dynasty on the throne, the 18th dynasty. Many of the most famous pharaohs are from this 18th dynasty. They left extraordinary monuments, especially in their capital, which is still a city nowadays, Luxor. And during this period, Egypt shined more than ever. It was more prosperous. It was strong militarily. It expanded to the south, to Nubia, and to the east. And it went through times of troubles occasionally, but overall, during the New Kingdom, Egypt remained stable and unified for several centuries, which is why the New Kingdom is considered a relevant historical period. So at the time, the pharaohs ruled from Thebes or Waset, and they were also buried there, on the west bank of the Nile, where the sun sets. the tradition of burying kings in extravagant pyramids had ended long ago, but not the one to bury them with treasures and offerings that would accompany them in the afterlife. And they were buried in underground tombs dug in the bedrock. There was a high concentration of these tombs in the Valley of the Kings for pharaohs' tombs, the Valley of the Queen for their spouses, and also on the same bank of the Nile there were many other simpler tombs for nobles and more ordinary people. So for centuries, the digging and the decoration of tombs was an important activity on the west bank of the Nile, and entire villages of craftsmen existed near them. The tomb of Tutankhamun, who was a pharaoh from the 18th dynasty, from the end of this dynasty, was among these numerous royal and aristocratic tombs. But obviously their concentration and all the treasures they were filled with underground attracted robbers early on. You could seal tombs and guard them as long as there was an organized state to do it. But in the end it was inevitable that these tombs would be visited by looters. This looting started in the antiquity, long before ancient Egypt even ended. A majority of tombs were accessed by digging galleries, or sometimes just finding their entrance underground once they were no longer guarded. This was risky for the looters, but the prize was huge. Even a minor pharaoh or noble could be buried with a large quantity of gold, of objects of jewelry, precious stones, and precious materials. Even their mummies could be resold and make a looter's fortune. This happened all along the antiquity and after, so that when Egyptology appeared as a field of investigation in the 19th century, and archaeologists began to study all the remains of the Egyptian civilization, almost everything had already been looted, including the mummies, because they had some commercial value in the Middle Ages, and more importantly, precious amulets and charms were placed near the bodies, wrapped in linen to symbolically protect the dead in the afterlife. But there were a few exceptions, rare cases when the tombs had been forgotten before looters broke in. And Tutankhamun's tomb is one such case. Almost one, actually, because his tomb was visited in the antiquity at an unknown date, and things were stolen. But the sarcophagus containing the mummy and plenty of artifacts were left untouched. Then, for unknown reasons, the tomb was sealed again, and the secret of its location was lost, probably still during the ancient Egyptian period, because above it a small hamlet, a group of huts for workmen, was built about 200 years after the burial of Tutankhamun, during the last decades of the New Kingdom. This probably protected the tomb from antique looters, because who could have imagined that the tomb of a king was hidden under humble huts? And for the same reason, the discovery of the tomb in the 20th century was accidental, The team, led by Howard Carter, was excavating the site of these huts, looking for remains that were expected to be humble, of workers of the late New Kingdom. But instead, one day, a young Egyptian boy who helped with the clearance of the site stumbled on a stone which turned out to be the top of a flight of steps cut into the bedrock. What could this be? Carter had the steps partially dug out, and his team reached the top of a doorway. There was at least one chamber underground, maybe more, and due to the location, under the ruins of huts that were more than 3,000 years old, it was likely that this mysterious structure underground had not been accessed for a very long time. So Carter immediately understood that this was a major discovery, even though he had no idea yet how incredible it would turn out to be. He alerted on his find, and slowly, cautiously, the stairway was cleared. This revealed seals bearing the name of Tutankhamun, a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, at the time known mainly by experts because he was a minor figure who had died young and ruled for a short time, only a few years, but still a pharaoh. This excavation led to a downward corridor that had been blocked with packed stone chippings, an unusual way of sealing tombs once the defunct had been placed in them. Unfortunately, a tunnel had been excavated through this blocking and then refilled, and at this point it appeared that the tomb had probably been desecrated in the antiquity, which was a bit discouraging. At the end of the tunnel, there was a second door that also had been breached and resealed. It was to be expected that what was beyond this door had been altered, maybe entirely emptied, but still, the tomb of a king will always reveal valuable information. A hole was made in this second door, and through it, hot air escaped from the chamber on the other side, air that no one had breathed in 3,000 years. Carter placed a candle near the hole and could look at what was on the other side. From the dark emerged statues, strange animals, objects, and everywhere the glint of gold. Despite attempts to access it, the chamber beyond the door was still full of wonders. Given the scope of this discovery, which was now confirmed, Carter sought help to explore the tomb, which had to be made methodically and cautiously. It was a chance that this tomb had not been found earlier, because in the 19th century, Egyptologists would have probably entered quickly and taken notes of everything, but without much care for all the information that the layout, the placement of artifacts, or even their state of conservation could reveal. In the 1920s, archaeology had already become much more analytical and was taken more seriously. There would be photographies of everything before it was even touched. Every object would be removed very slowly and carefully, and all the time necessary would be taken instead of rushing like a treasure hunter to the sarcophagus and open it, to see what was inside. The last objects were removed from this tomb in 1930, 8 years after its discovery, and the mummy of Tutankhamun was revealed only in 1925. That's 3 years after the entrance of the tomb was found. But during this careful exploration of the tomb in the 1920s, several deaths of people who had participated in the excavation or visited it were reported. It started with the financial backer of the excavation, George Herbert, Earl of Carnarvon. In April 1923, 4 months after the opening of the tomb, he died after a mosquito bite to his face had become infected. 6 weeks after that, George J. Gould I, the son of American railroad tycoon Jay Gould, died on the French Riviera. He had visited the tomb shortly after its opening on a trip to Egypt and developed a fever afterwards. In 1928, 5 years later, a member of Carter's team called A.C. Mace died after several years of illness. He had developed pneumonia in his final years. And in 1929, Carter's secretary, Richard Bethel, died in London at a club in Mayfair, the victim of suspected smothering. There were also non-lethal incidents that were reported. For example, shortly after the opening, Carter found a cobra, a very venomous snake, and also a symbol used by pharaohs that had entered his home. Writers and journalists began to become excited about these incidents, and in the 1920s, stories of a possible curse of Tutankhamun began to spread, or, more broadly, a curse of the pharaohs that would doom those who profanate their tombs, looters and archaeologists alike. Something was beginning to take shape, at least in popular culture, with all the ingredients that could make it an exciting story. Ancient kings of a brilliant civilization, treasures, tombs, the occult, fabulous discoveries, the modern man faced with ancient mysteries. Could pharaohs really have cursed profanators? Were these deaths just coincidences that were statistically normal, but were being spinned to create a narrative? And if not, could there be something in the tomb that would have killed people? We will come back to all this and to the credibility of such a curse. But before, we need to talk about the burial of pharaohs and how their tombs were protected. I told you earlier that Tutankhamun, or King Tut, was a name only known by experts in Egyptology before the discovery of his tomb. This is because he died aged 18 or 19 and did not do anything memorable during his reign, except restore the ancient Egyptian religion under the influence of the clergies of Egyptian gods. His likely father was Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, also known as Akhenaten. Akhenaten was a strange figure in the long line of pharaohs. He imposed the cult of the Aten, the sun disk, at the expense of all the other ancient gods of Egypt, especially the god Amun, which was the most influential deity the most influential cult of the New Kingdom and had a large and powerful clergy, especially in Thebes, which was where the cult originated. The rise of the 18th dynasty, of which Amenhotep was a part of, had made Amen the single most important god in the Egyptian pantheon, because he was the patron of Thebes or Waset. For reasons that are not precisely known, Amenhotep broke with the cult of Amen. It was not prohibited, but marginalized, and it lost royal favor. The reasons could have been political, because the clergy of Amen had become extraordinarily wealthy and powerful, or personal. Maybe he did sincerely believe that Aten was the new deity to worship, or a combination of both. But in any case, his reign put Egypt in trouble. The religious revolution he tried to impose on the country did not really work, did not really take roots in the population. And the powerful clergies of every ancient god turned against him. At the same time, there were internal tensions, whereas Egypt was threatened on its frontiers. He also built a new capital from scratch, a site called Amarna. I told you about it in a previous story. I'll put the link in the description. And he changed his name to Akhenaten. When he died, probably to many Egyptians' satisfaction or relief, there was a period of uncertainty for a couple of years. But then Amarna was abandoned and the old religion restored. The first successor to the throne, who stayed on it for more than a few months, was Tutankhamun, as I said, probably a son of Akhenaten. But he accessed at the age of 8 or 9, still a child, and probably with the support of a party that wanted to restore traditions, including the priests of Amen. The capital was moved back to Waset, to Thebes, and the name of Akhenaten and his heresy were erased from many documents and monuments. This is why Tutankhamun was always perceived as a weak, a minor figure. He reigned as a teenager, at a time when real power was probably in other people's hands, starting with his great vizier. The vizier was a kind of prime minister, a man called Ai. Ai could have been his granduncle or grandfather-in-law. We don't exactly know. What we know is that when Tutankhamun died childless, Ai became pharaoh. So this reign was only 9 years long and unremarkable, which is why Tutankhamun was essentially a name on a list of kings, known mainly by experts for the period of restoration of the old order that happened during his life, probably out of his control. But the fact that he died young, and probably unexpectedly, explains a lot about his tomb. However fabulous the treasures buried with him, we'll talk about that in a minute, they were probably relatively modest in comparison with what more powerful and long-lived pharaohs took with them in the afterlife. His tomb was relatively simple, modest in comparison with other kings. We led the excavation of the tomb just when Carter looked through a door, and saw that the room on the other side contained many objects. Beyond this door, there was in fact a room called the antechamber, with hundreds of objects, most of them precious. There were 3 different funeral beds, 4 different chariots. It is believed one was for hunting, 1 for war, and 2 for parades. Inside a large chest, there were military items, walking sticks, underwear, a trumpet made of copper alloy. All these objects were probably personal belongings that were left in the tomb to accompany the dead in the afterlife. But this antechamber was just a taste of what was to come. It had been searched 3,000 years earlier, presumably by robbers, who had taken a few things, but there were 2 more rooms where they had left an extraordinary treasure, and most importantly, they had never reached Tutankhamun's coffin and his mummy. First, on the side of the antechamber, there was the burial chamber, the room where the body was placed. The mummy was placed in a coffin, placed in larger coffins, which themselves were in a sarcophagus, that is to say, a larger stone coffin sealed with a lid. But the sarcophagus was not visible. It was surrounded by several larger wooden structures, like big closets called shrines, which were gilded and decorated very carefully. This kind of giant Russian doll was placed in the burial chamber, and the last 2 shrines, which contained the sarcophagus and the coffins, had not been looted. This is why it took so much time to reach the mummy while studying every object found within the shrines and opening them without damaging anything. All these elements are now at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and we owe the possibility to see them to the care with which the tomb was studied. The larger shrine, the outer one, occupied almost the entire room, which was rectangular, leaving only 1 foot on the sides and 2 feet at either end. This didn't leave much space for other things, and the burial chamber only contained a few containers for scents, lamps, and several paddles that symbolically would serve on the solar boat on which the king would travel to the land of eternal life. This room was still richly decorated with frescoes on the walls. It was the only decorated room of the tomb. And on the side, there was yet another room called the treasury, containing the treasure. Over 5,000 objects, including many gilded statuettes of the king and deities, model boats, 2 more chariots. This sounds like a lot, especially adding to this all the jewels and the impressive mask that covered the mummy inside the last coffin. But it was probably almost a low-cost burial for a pharaoh. First, because of the tomb itself. Only 1 room, the burial chamber, was decorated, and generally all of them were. One hypothesis is that the funeral was rushed, because the king died unexpectedly. Typically, people, especially kings, anticipated the digging and decoration of their tombs early, so that everything would be ready in time. It seems that in the case of Tutankhamun, the tomb was rushed. Its structure, its layout, is not identical to royal tombs of the same period. So it is supposed that it was prepared for someone else, a noble maybe, and repurposed. Tutankhamun was also not a particularly prestigious ruler. He won no battle, nor did any reform that we know of. And he was also physically disabled. He had a deformity of his left foot that forced him to walk with a cane. He had scoliosis, and the study of his mummy revealed that he had contracted several strains of malaria during his life. So to the people at the court and the powerful nobles of Egypt, he was most probably perceived as a weak king who would die without a heir. He was still buried as a pharaoh, and this included a lengthy process to prepare the mummy, a fastuous tomb, several weeks of national mourning, but there is no reason to think any extra effort was made. Tutankhamun owes all his modern fame to the miraculous preservation and discovery of his tomb, and for a part too, to the legend of a curse. So let's go back to the curse of the pharaohs story. Did the ancient Egyptians really try to scare people away from their tombs with threats of curses? Actually, probably not. Maybe there were rumors about it. There certainly were harsh punishments, death, for anyone trying to break into a king's tomb. But there were very few curses relative to tombs in general in ancient Egypt. Maybe because they didn't think about it. But another hypothesis is that the idea of such a desecration was dangerous to record in writing. If you write a curse or threats at the entrance of a tomb, you admit the idea that the unthinkable could happen and the tomb could be robbed. So maybe out of superstition there were barely any warnings or threats written, even though they may have existed orally. The rare occurrences of curses that have been found were not in royal tombs, but rather in smaller private tombs for nobles and nobles of the Old Kingdom, that is to say 1,000 years before the time of King Tutankhamun. But when there were inscriptions like these, it seems they were more directed at the priests who were supposed to take care of the tomb, rather than looters. If the priests did not keep the tomb pure, there would be consequences, but actual robbers were not mentioned or addressed. Still, they knew very well that looting was a thing, and they addressed the concern hiding the tomb underground and making it hard to access. It was generally not enough to stop robbers, especially in periods when Egypt was in trouble and order was not well maintained. But overall, there is barely any evidence in archaeology that supports the concept, the idea of a curse of the pharaohs. Actually, this idea appeared with the development of Egyptology in the 19th century. Maybe because the discovery of ancient Egypt was fascinating on many levels. Probably also because, even though they justified it, archaeologists were aware that they were desecrating tombs and often exposing the corpses of dead people in museums or even in private events. There were a lot of these in the 19th century, organized to open a coffin in public because of people's interest. A coffin containing a mummy was brought more or less legally to London or Paris, and the organizers of the expedition who had brought it turned the opening into a social event with a scientific or historical twist. So this could not leave anyone insensitive. It was generally unsaid, but there was always something vaguely obscene about exposing the remains of real people to the public's curiosity and emptying tombs for treasures that had been left as part of a funerary ritual. And so between the fascination for ancient Egypt, the guilt, the taste for the occult that was on the rise in the 19th century, there was a good ground for legend of curses around mummies to appear. The first tales, novels or short stories of mummies coming back to life appeared almost 200 years ago, and mummy fiction became a trend, a thing, along the 19th century, especially in British Gothic literature, together with other fantastic creatures born from ancient magic or science, werewolves, vampires, the creature of Frankenstein. Mummies were a subgenre that had less success than vampires, but to the educated public in Europe and America, they became part of fantastic literature. People knew what it was about, and the idea of a curse hitting the desecrators of a tomb became easily recognizable. Without it, there could not have been a story around the tomb of Tutankhamun. When the tomb was discovered, there was a new spike in interest for ancient Egypt. Maybe the fact that it happened in the 1920s was also very important to the British, French or German public. Because in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the ideal of the European scientist, historian, archaeologist, making wonderful discoveries, explaining the world, more generally of science and progress, illuminating the past and the path to the future. These were very widespread and popular themes. But then came the First World War and its atrocities. The mood changed, and in the early 1920s there was a sense that a lot had been lost. Not just millions of lives, financial ruin and destruction, but also faith in the future and the very notion of faith in progress. It was not so much the case in America, thanks to continuing prosperity and the absence of destruction on American soil in the First World War. But in Western Europe, the kind of pre-war optimism and intellectual satisfaction that prevailed 20 years earlier had completely vanished. So in 1922, the discovery of this tomb felt like a return to the good old days, a good dose of exotism, an intriguing ancient civilization, a fabulous treasure, an adventure. In a word, the kind of stories that could re-enchant the world. And as a result, the interest for Carter's work and progressive reveal of what was inside the tomb until the climax with the opening of the last coffin in 1925. This was huge. The press was there. Anything printed about Tutankhamun's tomb could sell very well. And as often, demand creates supply. Newspapers were not only interested in the tomb itself, but also everything around it. How it had been found, by whom, who were these people, and what happened to them. Only 1 month after the opening of the tomb, an account about the intrusion of a cobra at Carter's house appeared in the New York Times. And obviously the parallel with the symbol of ancient pharaohs was made immediately. Even though in reality pharaohs had different symbols, the cobra was one among others, a protector that appeared on their crowns. Then it escalated with the death of Lord Carnarvon a few weeks later for this mosquito bite that had become infected. The creator of Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle, suggested that the death had been caused by so-called elementals created by Tutankhamun's priests to protect the tomb. A claim that was not really made very seriously and was based much more on this 19th century literature and tradition that we just talked about, rather than archaeology. But this fueled further the media interest. And from this moment on, people tried to actively find a new element, death or incidents that could be attributed to a curse. And it seemed to culminate in 1923, in May, when George Day Gould I died of the fever he had contracted after visiting the tomb. There were rumors that inscriptions at the entrance of the tomb warned anyone who would enter, which is just not the case. There are no such inscriptions. But even though it was debunked, the idea stayed. So did the hypothesis that people were poisoned by toxins or fungi that would have been liberated when the tomb was opened. No such elements were ever found, and the first dead, Lord Carnarvon, had been subject to infections long before he financed the archaeological expedition. But the concept of some sort of poison placed inside the tomb, voluntarily or not, stayed and still resurfaces in popular culture. Every time you see a tomb with a gas trap in Indiana Jones or Tomb Raider movies, this concept is an echo from the 1920s and the speculation around Tutankhamun's tomb. So, what evidence is there to the existence of a curse? Actually, not much. There were 2 deaths of relatively young people who had a connection with the discovery, the financial backer and a visitor. But the circle of people who entered the tomb in 1922 and 1923 is much larger than that. Dozens or maybe even hundreds of people. If there was a curse, you would expect it to hit the people who opened the entrance of the tomb, Egyptian workers and Howard Carter and his team. No incident was ever reported among the Egyptians, and in Carter's circle, the only death in the 1920s was his secretary several years later. Carter himself died in 1939, 17 years after his discovery, aged 64 from cancer, not an infectious disease. You would expect the effects of a curse to be maybe a bit quicker and obvious, all the more that Carter became a star of archaeology. He benefited a lot from this discovery and probably had a destiny he could not even have dreamt of prior to it. But more generally, it appears that the concept of Curse of the Pharaohs is more a literary and cultural idea than anything rooted in actual evidence. As we have seen, there were no such curses or threats directed at robbers on Egyptian tombs, or only exceptionally, and the possibility that tombs are dangerous because there would be some kind of toxin or fungi, which was reasonable and deserved to be studied, this was never proven. So it is hard to conclude anything else than the legend is just that, a legend. But it remains interesting to see where it comes from and how it influenced fiction, especially films. Every single film with mummies since the 1930s, they all contain warnings, curses, and the death of people who have desecrated tombs. Now that we have finished our first story, it is time to remind you that there are timestamps on your screen, in the description and the first comment pinned under this video. In the same comment, you will find links to audio streaming sites like Spotify or Apple Music, or you can search for me there. You can listen to everything on these sites if this is more convenient for you. There is also a link to my Patreon page. You are able to listen to this video and all others on my channel without ad breaks, either because you have a YouTube Premium subscription, and in this case you already support this channel financially by listening, so thank you. Or if it is not the case, this is thanks to the contribution of all my patrons. They deserve your gratitude, and they certainly have mine. When you join my Patreon, you can also get all the stories as podcasts, with or without background sound effects. You can download audios and videos, and get information about what I'm working on. So don't hesitate to check the page if you feel inspired to join it. And now, let's move on to our second story of the night. And this time, instead of looking at the past, we'll look at the stars, and maybe, who knows, the future. On August the 15th, 1977, a radio telescope at the Ohio State University detected a strong radio signal that appeared to come from the constellation Sagittarius. A signal that bore the expected hallmarks of extraterrestrial origin. We will see in a minute what this means. This radio telescope was actively looking for extraterrestrial signals as a part of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, also known as SETI, S-E-T-I. So, to begin with, and understand its relevance, we need to talk about SETI. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence started earlier than one may think, as early as the late 19th century, when wireless transmission via radio waves was invented. If it was possible to communicate with other locations on Earth, without equipment like a cable? Why not with other planets? And so the first hypotheses and experimentations were aimed at trying to receive or send signals to other planets of the solar system, especially Mars. Inventors and engineers like Tesla or Marconi were interested in the idea. But there were no conclusive discoveries. They sometimes thought that they had received radio signals from space, but these were most probably naturally occurring radio noise. Radio noise can be emitted when a natural satellite moves through the magnetosphere of a planet. For example, in the solar system, there is the case of Io, the moon of Jupiter, which is quite close to the planet and may be a big source of radio noise. So they didn't find anything conclusive, but this was just the beginning. Decades passed, and radio telescopes appeared. The first one was built in the 1930s. What is a radio telescope? The term telescope can be a bit misleading because in everyday language it suggests that it is for visual observation. But a radio telescope is an antenna with a radio receiver used to detect radio waves from astronomical sources very far away. I guess you are all familiar with these pictures of large antenna fields. These are radio telescopes, and like any antenna, they can be oriented to a particular area of the sky to listen or more precisely receive and analyze radio signals that come from it. What we generally think of when we hear the word telescope is optical telescope, which study the light wave spectrum. But at the end of the day, we make these distinctions because of our senses. These are all waves of different frequencies. Under a frequency of about 20 kHz, the waves are part of audio frequency. If they propagate through an appropriate environment, matter like air, we can hear them as sounds. Above a frequency of 20 kHz and up to around 300 GHz, that's a very large range, energy can radiate into space, in the void, and this is called the radio frequency. Still increasing the frequency, then begins the realm of infrared radiation with a frequency from about 300 GHz to 430 terahertz, another huge leap in frequency. Infrared is considered a type of light, but one that our eyes cannot see, because our sense of vision is limited to a narrower spectrum, a narrower range of wavelength. By the way, what is the difference between frequency and wavelength? These are two ways of measuring waves. If you visualize a wave as a line, a curve that goes up and down, the wavelength is the distance between two peaks. Frequency is the number of times a wave occurs in a given time. When expressed in hertz, 1 hertz is 1 cycle per second. So the two are related because the shorter the wavelength, small oscillations, the higher the frequency. Hertz are commonly expressed in multiples. 1 kilohertz is 1000 cycles per second. 1 megahertz is 1 million. 1 gigahertz is 1 billion. So when we speak of infrared of, let's say, 400 gigahertz, we are saying the wave oscillates 400 billion times in 1 second. That's really fast. Then, still going up in frequencies, there is the spectrum of visible light with different perceived colors by our sense of vision as the frequency continues to increase. And above it, ultraviolet, light waves that have an even smaller wavelength and that we can no longer see. So as you see, our senses only perceive and can do something with small portions of the range of the spectrum of existing waves. But we have created devices to receive and use waves our senses do not perceive, or not well enough. Basically, optical telescopes magnify and help us see better objects in visible light. And radio devices, including radio telescopes, help us hear, transcript information that travels at inaudible and invisible frequencies. Now, as you also know, radio telescopes are big equipments, and they have these large parabolic antennas, this kind of large cup, of large dish, which is a collector of waves. A bit like the shape of our ears help us collect sound waves. Their design helps listen to astronomical waves. The first of these big equipments appeared in the 1930s, and then they only multiplied in the 1950s and 60s. They are not just useful for the detection of possible extraterrestrial signals that another form of intelligence would have sent. They are used to study celestial bodies, close ones like the Sun, to very distant ones like exoplanets. These bodies and their interactions with others produce waves, radio noises, that are rich in information. The radio telescope that detected the WOW signal was nicknamed Big Ear, and it specialized after its construction into SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. The 1960s were a time of strong interest in space and its exploration, as you know, and this extended to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, mainly through radio telescopes. In 1963, the famous Arecibo telescope was built in Puerto Rico. The dish was built into a natural sinkhole, which allowed to make it gigantic. Its diameter was 305 meters, about 1,000 feet, and it made it well suited to participate in SETI programs. Now, as I said before, the range of frequencies of radio waves is quite large, and it is impossible to listen to all frequencies at the same time. There is also a lot of radio noise in space. Different elements naturally emit different types of waves. And this is actually a very good thing for our discovery, our knowledge of astronomy and astrophysics, because it means telescopes can detect the elements distant bodies are made of: hydrogen, helium, oxygen, and so on, just by scanning the waves they emit. But in order to search for extraterrestrial signals on all these possible frequencies, coming possibly from any corner of space, one has to narrow down the search. Only a small sector of space can be examined at once, and only a narrow band of frequencies. Early on in SETI investigations, a preference emerged for the frequency of 1420 MHz. Why? Because it is the frequency naturally emitted by hydrogen, and hydrogen is the most common element in the universe. So an advanced extraterrestrial civilization, advanced enough to know and use radio waves, could be drawn to this particular frequency, which also has a second advantage. It travels very well in space, because it is unaffected by interstellar dust. That makes two good reasons to imagine that extraterrestrial beings would use this frequency to emit and receive. But this is just an informed guess. There is obviously no way to know for sure at this point how extraterrestrials would see the cosmos, think. It is just an attempt at finding a common ground that at least makes sense to us, but still a guess. In any case, it is on this particular frequency that the Arecibo telescope sent a well-known message in 1974 that carried coded basic information about Earth and humans. This message was aimed at a cluster of thousands of stars that is about 22,000 light years away. So, unless the message is intercepted before, it will reach its destination in 22,000 years, and a possible response could arrive in 44,000 years if they immediately send something back. But returning to our story, Big Ear, the telescope that received the WOW signal, was set to this particular frequency, 1420 GHz, and aimed at the constellation Sagittarius. It was functioning 24/7. There were no operators taking turn to listen with headphones. This is a movie thing. The radio signals received were recorded and treated by a big computer. Imagine we are in 1977. Then printed on paper, and the long strips of paper were checked manually, visually, for possible emissions that stood out from radio noise. And this is precisely what the WOW signal is. On this day in 1977, for 72 seconds, a signal was recorded, and actually discovered several days after the fact when the printed paper was examined. Jerry Eman, the astrophysicist who checked the measurements, was astonished, and he wrote WOW on the paper, which is why it became known as the WOW signal. What made it stand out and justified this excitement? First, the signal was very narrowband, about 10 kHz, meaning that it was emitted on a very small range of frequencies. And that's interesting because no known natural phenomenon, including to this day, emits on such a narrow spectrum of frequencies. So if it is not natural, it could mean the signal was produced by a form of intelligence. Second, it came precisely on the wavelength emitted by hydrogen, the one favored to find signs of extraterrestrial intelligence, and this is why it could be detected and recorded. This frequency was not used by artificial emitters on Earth. There was an international agreement to ban it from military or civilian usage. Yet another point, a third one, is that it came from a precise direction, and there was no significant known celestial object in the zone where it originated, except two small comets. And finally, fourth point, given the width of the telescope's observation window, it could observe any given point for only 72 seconds, because the telescope is on Earth, and Earth rotates, so obviously it cannot stay in place examining the exact same point. The telescope is in motion with the planet. This means that if a continuous extraterrestrial signal was registered, it would last only 72 seconds, and you would expect the intensity of the signal to rise for 36 seconds as the telescope aligns with its point of origin. Then there would be a peak just after 36 seconds at the center of the observation window. And after this peak, the intensity would decrease for 36 seconds as the telescope moved away from the point of origin. And this was exactly what was observed. These characteristics are all present in the WOW signal, hence the reaction of the astrophysicist. So, how to explain this? The first possibility, at least technically, would be that the signal was a fake, fabricated for whatever reasons, like to draw attention. This looks very unlikely, actually. It was all recorded by a computer with no possibility to alter the results discreetly. The team that detected it had a strong reputation, was always open with the data, and actually very cautious, skeptical with the interpretation. So it seems this signal was indeed received. No code, no message indicating an intelligence behind it could ever be deciphered from it. If there had been one, it would be a strong indication that there was an intelligence behind it. But nothing of the sort was found until now. Another kind of explanation that appeared quickly could have been that the signal had a terrestrial origin. The frequency was forbidden for any other task than astronomical research, but it doesn't mean the prohibition of this spectrum was always respected. So what if the signal had come from Earth and had been reflected, sent back by a piece of space debris? Conceptually, it makes sense, but technically it doesn't seem to work well, because a spaceborne reflector would need totally unrealistic requirements in terms of positioning, motion and energy to send back this observed signal. So this kind of explanation, a kind of fake positive due to a reflector in space, doesn't really work either. Yet another hypothesis that was put forth long after, in the 2010s, was that these comets in the sector of the sky from which the signal apparently originated could have been the source. There could have been a nitrogen cloud surrounding them. But this possibility was also dismissed by astronomers because the comets were not in the right location, the right beam, at the correct time. So here we are. There is to this day no satisfactory explanation to the WOW signal. It could actually be of extraterrestrial origin and not a natural phenomenon. But the biggest problem to this scenario is that the observation could never be replicated. Of course, as soon as the signal was found, An alert was sent, and other radio telescopes tried to examine the same coordinates on the same frequency. The same telescope, Big Ear, also tried to find the signal again when it returned to the same position. Dozens of times, but nothing. The signal had gone, and only the usual radio noise of space could be recorded. It doesn't mean there was no intelligence behind it. It could have been a one-time signal, but the absence of replication is always a big problem in science. If multiple telescopes had received it, or if it could have been intercepted again, the case for an extraterrestrial intelligence behind it would be much stronger. What we are left with is, to this day, a true mystery that remains unexplained. And this mystery, this signal, is to date the strongest candidate for an alien radio transmission ever detected. We are at the end of our mystery stories for tonight. There are many more on my channel if you are interested. I put links in the description. And other types of stories. If you're into history, mythology, astronomy, science. But for now, you can let go and fall asleep. I'll leave you with sounds of Fireplace to lull you to sleep. Sleep well. Sweet dreams.